Chapter 38. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The idle man on the street. In fact, Gu Shiha shouldn't complain because the unluckiest one was study companion Ranmo. Second young master was weak and couldn't carry the things. Hence, he carried them. Second young mistress couldn't carry things because she was a woman. So, he carried them. Fourth young master was busy shopping. When would he, have time to carry things? Therefore, he carried them. As a result, his hands were full and the things even blocked his eyes. He couldn't even see the road in front of him, and he still had to keep an eye on those three to avoid them getting lost. The hardest errand in this world was nothing more than this. Originally, he had fought with Dian about who would go out with fourth young master. Now, he couldn't help but feel deep regret. If he had known that it would be like this, he wouldn't have fought with Dian. Perhaps, at this moment he, would be enjoying delicious food and drinks at Plum Flower Pavilion instead. Xu Huan was kinder than the two others. Seeing Ranmo look so tired and so much sweat pouring off him that half of his clothes were already wet, she couldn't stand idle anymore. After all, this study companion only looked about 1 or 2 years older than Gu Shiha. He was still a child. She reached out and took some boxes from Ranmo. Ranmo wanted to stop her, but his hand couldn't be vacated. He had no way to stop her and could only say with a bitter expression, "Don't do that. Let this little one carry them for you." Xu Huan shook her head and said, "No need, I'm dying now. It would be strange if I don't carry things." Although it was said like that, Ranmo still didn't dare to bother her. He chased after her and pestered her to give the things back. After getting annoyed from being pestered, Xu Huan looked around. She remembered that she had seen a lot of idle men dressed in coarse clothing walking around. Only after she'd asked Gu Shiha did she got to know that these people just hung around the street when they had nothing to do. They usually did things like passing a message and buy and send things for people. Hence, she wanted to pay someone to help them carry the things. It was just that she didn't know much about this profession. She didn't know which one to pick and felt that those idle men looked like hooligans from the street. She was afraid that if she didn't choose the right one, that person would run away with their things. Then, it would really be searching for trouble for oneself. Just when she was in deep thoughts, her eyes suddenly met a pair of eyes full of expression. She couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. She was stunned not because those eyes were too piercing. Instead, it was the contrary. When she looked carefully, she saw that the brightness of those eyes disappeared. Now, they looked unremarkable. It was as if that glimpse of just now was just her imagination. "What's the matter?" Gu Shiran noticed her unusual behavior when she stared in a daze for a moment and stopped in his tracks. Xu Huan didn't say anything, she just raised her chin and pointed at the direction where the person stood. Gu Shiran looked at the direction she pointed at and saw a young man leaning against the wall. He seemed to be in his early 20s. His coarse clothing was covered with patches, but it was unusually clean and tidy. While they were looking at him, the young man walked over to them. "Excuse me, do you want to hire someone?" Xu Huan hadn't answered yet when those idle men saw that there was business at this side. They shouted and then 3 or 4 came over. One of them pushed the young man away, while the others bowed and fawned upon them. "Where are masters going? Do you need help with carrying the things? To take it to the east or the north of the city is only 10 copper coins. It's also 10 copper coins for taking it to the west or south of the city." Some even reached out to take the things from Ranmo. They also smiled, "Little master, these things are too heavy. I will hold them for you." Ranmo had often been sent out to buy things. He wasn't scared of these idlers that surrounded them. The two masters didn't speak, how would he dare to hire someone to carry the things? He dodged them and said, "Go, go, go, don't cause trouble for me." It was a total chaos here, but Gu Shiran only looked at that young man. After he was pushed away, his expression didn't change. He only tightened his fists shortly before released them again. He turned and was about to leave when Gu Shiran raised his head slightly and shouted at him, "Please, wait." When these words came out, those idlers stopped being chaotic. That young man turned his face, looking slightly surprised and asked, "Calling me?" Gu Shiran nodded and said to those idlers, "Everyone, I am sorry. I plan to hire him. Please go busy yourself elsewhere." His words were polite. Even if the idlers were reluctant, they were unable to do anything. Just when they were about to disperse, the one who pushed that young man just now turned his face and glared at the young man. Then, he said to Gu Shiran, "This master, you probably don't know. These brothers of mine always eke out a living on this street. The shopkeepers nearby are familiar with us. If you want to send something, you just have to shout, and before you'd arrived home, the things would have already arrived. In case something went wrong, you can come here to look for us, unlike that one over there, who no one knows where he came from and who could snatch your things or break them. In case that happens, you won't even know where to find him." What he said was sensible and appropriate. Also, he seemed to be hinting at something. After hearing that, Gu Shiran nodded slightly. That person thought that he got the business and said happily, "Then." That word just left his mouth when he was cut off by Gu Shiran laughingly, "Next time." The idlers scattered helplessly. When they passed the young man, they reached out to push him. There was even one who spitted on him. That young man lowered his head and didn't say anything. His attitude was extremely silent and persevering. This made Xu Huan frown slightly. She felt that these idlers really seemed like local ruffians who stole each other businesses, like stealing each other territories. In fact, she'd guessed right. Sometimes these people would work as ruffians and they put a high regard on their territory. In most cases, they would be well behaved. Even if they wanted to bully people, with their years of experience on the streets, they could guess the other party's identity with just a slight glance. They knew very well what kind of people they could provoke and what kind they couldn't. Let's not talk about the idlers. The young man took the things from Ranmo. He didn't say a word. He didn't even care about the price and just followed behind them. If one didn't pay attention, they could ignore his existence. The four strolled on the street for some more. The sun was already at its highest. Gu Shiha was hungry, so he wasn't happy to continue strolling. He picked a restaurant with a good reputation and was ready to go have lunch. Xu Huan and Gu Shiran naturally wouldn't object when someone was treating them. Besides, they were also tired. They were about to find a place to rest. Hence, they followed into the restaurant and looked for a private room. However, all the private rooms were full. The four were indeed very tired. They weren't happy to move. They put up with it and found a table near the window. There was a difference between masters and servants. Ranmo didn't dare to sit and stood at a side. Xu Huan was a bit surprised when seeing him follow the rules so strictly. She felt that she should also stand up, but she was truly tired. When her butt stuck to the chair, it didn't want to move anymore. When she was hesitating, she heard Gu Shiran say, "You also sit." Ranmo was terrified, this little one doesn't dare. Gu Shiran said faintly, "We are not at home. There aren't so many rules here." Ranmo was still hesitating, but Gu Shiha got impatient, "He let you sit, then just sit. It's just a small matter like a fart. Why are so being so overly fussy?" While talking, he took a small piece of silver from his purse, knocked on the table with great enthusiasm and shouted, "Bring the best wine and the best dishes here. No need to help this young master save money." Chapter 39. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The ecstasy of the purple lilac when encountering a master who was generous, the servant who served in the hall, was very flattering. He took over the silver while he unctuous fawned. When he shouted for the food, his voice was loud and energetic. All the people in the restaurant heard it. Quite a few looked over here. While Gu Shihe was feeling proud, Ranmo suddenly jumped out of the chair and said, "Not good." "What again?" Gu Shihe was surprised for a moment and was very displeased with his, flustered behavior. Ranmo said with a bitter face, "Fourth young master, the person who followed us seemed to have disappeared." Xu Huan was a bit surprised. She quickly turned to look. That quiet young man who didn't have any sense of existence disappeared, and they didn't even know when he had disappeared. Naturally, the things he carried disappeared with him. "No." Gu Shihe slammed on the table and stood up. He said furiously, "He actually dared to take our things." While talking, he screamed that he wanted to report the case to the authorities. This attracted many people to look over here again. Gu Shiran reached out and pressed his shoulder. "Sit down. Don't make an exhibition of yourself." Gu Shihe was pressed down, but he was unwilling to submit and stood up again. He said with his head raised, "When did I make an exhibition of myself? It was obvious that that person took our things. If we don't report him to the authorities, are we waiting to be the unlucky victims?" At this time, the servant of the restaurant returned with tea. When he heard this, he interjected laughingly while he divided the cups and poured tea into the pot, "Customer, who had such a big gut to dare steal things from you?" Gu Shihe said angrily, "Those idlers on the street. We hired one to help carry the things. Who would have thought that he was gone in a blink of an eye?" While talking, he pushed Ranmo, "Hurry up and go report to the authorities." Ranmo looked with an expression that he was in a difficult position at Gu Shiran. He was comforted by his gaze. Hence, he didn't move. He heard that servant say, "Isn't the one that customer hired one of those people from Lu Er's group?" Gu Shihe was stunned and said, "I just hired a helper. Why should I ask for his name?" The servant shook his head, "That was not what this little one meant. I mean that Lu Er's group often took up tasks in this street. They don't have to do such a thing to smash their own reputation. If the matter that they had stolen your things got out, who would still dare to hire them? I am afraid that the one you hired is someone who you don't know his roots. He would just take a business, stole it and then run away. Even if you report to the authorities, you may not catch him." After all, Gu Shihe was young and didn't experience many things. Hearing the servant say that and also remembering the words of those idlers, Gu Shihe was at loss of what to do. He didn't know whether he should urge Ranmo to go report to the authorities or that he should admit that he was unlucky and wouldn't pursue this any longer. Gu Shiran leisurely picked up the tea and took a sip. It was as if he didn't care about this matter. Xu Huan looked at this one and then looked at the other one. Anyway, the one who should decide was here. So, she decided to shut up, pretend to be non-existent and drank tea. Seeing her like this, Gu Shihe also learned to be smart. He sat down and ignored the matter, but he still couldn't help but ask, "Second big brother, how come you have no temper?" Gu Shiran lightly swept over him, "What use does it have to throw a temper? Would he come back if you are angry? The anger would harm my body. It's not worth it. When did this guy begin to be narcissistic?" Xu Huan was speechless. Didn't know for what reason, but the corners of the servant's lips drew back and he slipped away. Gu Shihe said dissatisfied, "Can we really let someone deceive us like this? I can't swallow this. Let's wait and see." While talking, Gu Shiran put down the cup of tea and looked at the out of the entrance. Gu Shihe was surprised and also looked. Aside from those entering and leaving customers, he didn't see anything. He became angrier. The speed of this restaurant was quite fast. Only after 3 cups of tea, the servant had filled the table with dishes. He also came with a jar of green plum wine that had been stored for 5 years. Sure enough, there was an intoxicating scent that filled the nose. After he saw the wine, Gu Shihe immediately became excited. He completely threw the matter of the stolen things to the back of his head. The servant took a jug of wine from the jar and asked with a smile, "Customers, do you want me to boil this wine before drinking? No need, no need. Gu Shihe rushed to push his cup in front of the servant. Pour wine. The wine was poured, but he didn't have time to pick it up yet when he saw a hand reach over and took the cup. When he looked, he saw that it was Shu Huan. He immediately said annoyed, "You. What you? Children aren't allowed to drink wine." While Shu Huan said that she put the cup in front of herself. This little brat was already very active without alcohol. If he drinks this wine, perhaps, he would even act like a drunkard. Gu Shihe fell out with her and said, "Why do you care? Give it back to me. You're not allowed to drink." This time it was Gu Shiran who spoke. Little fourth young master looked twice at him, groaned and complained, "Today is second big brother's birthday. Can't I even toast to you with 3 cups of wine? Here." Gu Shiran pushed the teacup in front of him. "Toasting is just to show your heart. I won't mind if you take tea instead of wine." Little fourth young master was dejected. He glared at that teacup. At this time, there was a commotion outside. Shu Huan couldn't help but turn around to look. Looking in a hurry, she saw 6 or 7 people came in while surrounding a fat man. They shouted, "A private room. Bring the best wine and the best dishes. The speed has to be fast." These words were very familiar. Shu Huan turned and looked once at Gu Shihe. She couldn't help but sneak a laugh. She didn't expect that Gu Shiran would knock Gu Shihe's head. "Eat." As the words fell, Gu Shiran picked her favorite fish and shrimps and put them into the bowl in front of her. Shu Huan was speechless. She was just about to pick up her chopsticks when suddenly a very heavy fragrance that could choke people flew over. She looked up. The first thing that came to sight was an elegant purple lilac. When her gaze went up, she saw a fat face with oil stains. It was that fat man who came in from the outside. The fat man had a mystified smile on his face. That smile made the roots of her teeth turn sour. She quickly turned her face and didn't dare to look again. If she looked again, she wouldn't be able to have lunch. In fact, this person wasn't ugly. At least, his features were regular. He looked like he was in his early 30s. There were still short scums on his chin. His age matched with that bright and fat face, and if the color of his clothes was calmer, he would look like someone from a rich family. However, he was dressed in a purple robe. So tender, lovely and fancy. People who looked at it almost became a mess. Presumably, Gu Shihe was also stunned by this sight. He didn't know whether he should vomit or swallow his mouthful of food. Only Gu Shiran frowned slightly and said, "Sire, do you want something?" Hearing him spoke, the fat man smiled of exultation. He slightly pulled up his sleeves, revealing a thick gold bracelet on his wrist, and cupped his hand at Gu Shiran. "The moment I entered, I saw that brother's bearing is out of the ordinary. I took the initiative to come over and invite brother. Asking brother to please give face. How about we have lunch and wine together?" There was no big problem with what he said, but the tone in which this person spoke with was amorous, and the way he looked at Gu Shiran made Shu Huan get goosebumps. If when she saw him, she felt the roots of her teeth become sour like eating green plums, then now it was like she drank a whole jar of vinegar. She felt sour from head to toe. Chapter 40. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The man who forced a man. Gu Shiran's expression had never been so black. His lips were tightened in a straight line. This was a sight that he was forbearing his fury. He lowered his eyelids to cover the anger in his eyes. He said faintly, "We don't know each other. No need to bother. Sire, please go your way." The fat man hadn't spoken yet when the people beside him began to groan. Someone intimidated, "Our young master is the brother-in-law of the county magistrate. Is it a humiliation to invite you to have a drink?" Someone tempted, "Go inquire. Young master likes to make friends the most. If you become his beloved friend, then you won't have to ask for anything anymore from anyone else in the future. Young master would take care of everything for you. Someone was crude and directly slammed on the table. Brat, don't refuse a toast and only be forced to drink a forfeit. If you don't give this one face today, then don't think about taking half a step out of this restaurant. Someone even dallied. Don't be so rude. If you anger this master, GXR, then young master would feel heartache. Vulgar and amorous laughter rang. There were many guests in the restaurant, but they know the identity of this fat man, so they sneaked away afraid of getting into trouble. Those who looked, whispered to one another. Even the shopkeeper and the servant shrunk at a side and didn't dare to come to pacify. They were afraid that they would make the fat man unhappy and would get into trouble. Neither anger or happiness could be detected from Gu Shiran's face, but his lips tightened even more. When the fat man saw him like this, he thought that Gu Shiran was interested and showed conceit. He said, "Go, bring a chair over. Also, go pay this table's meal." This master and this brother felt a familiarity at first sight and want to sit here to have a drink together. As he said that, he leaned to Gu Shiran's side and swept over him, GXR, with a very vulgar gaze. He also sniffed gently. He seemed so intoxicated that it would make people want to vomit. Finally, Gu Shiha, who was in shock, returned to his senses. He was always hot-tempered and it had always been him, who bullied people. How could he accept being bullied? He stood up fiercely and cursed, "Drink together your ass." While he spoke, he picked up a plate of dishes from the table and threw that plate on that fat man's face. A splash of porcelain, vegetables and sauce could be seen. That fat man immediately screamed like a pig that was being killed. When the people who followed the fat man saw that the situation wasn't right, they immediately came to help. One even raised his hand and scolded, "Little brat, you dared to attack." Seeing that the slap was about to fall, Ranmo slammed into that person. Although he was young and didn't have much strength, but when he slammed into that person's belly, it could be considered that he got that person's soft spot. That person stumbled a few steps back and fell on the ground. After all, the other party had more people. During the chaos, someone came to grab Gu Shiran's arm. Who would have thought that he took out a porcelain bottle and cork? He poured that unknown liquid on the person who came to grab him. That person immediately covered his eyes and screamed. Things got started like this. Xu Huan was also someone impulsive. Originally, she still had some scruples and was afraid that she would bring trouble to Gu Shiran, but now they obviously couldn't be friendly anymore. She didn't have to stay seated while being beaten. She took advantage of the chaos and that no one paid attention to her. She grabbed a chair, stepped on the table, looked at that fat man's head and slammed the chair down his head. The chair broke into pieces. The fat man screamed with a bloodied face. Beat them. Don't let one escape. Temporarily, the fight was evenly matched because they acted first. However, now the fat man's men guardingly surrounded them. They didn't seem to have a chance to attack anymore. Gu Shiha and Ranmo were forced to retreat 2 steps. Xu Huan felt that it was too eye-catching standing on a table and jumped down. As a result, she was grabbed by Gu Shiran and pulled behind his back. She grumbled inwardly because she didn't know how to break through. The fat man's hand covered his bloodied head. The eyes that looked at Gu Shiran became fierce. This master will give you one more chance. Obediently pour a cup of wine for this master to apologize. Otherwise, this master would let people beat you and then drag you back. This was forcing a man. From taking liberties to forcing people. Truly one thunder was stronger than another. Xu Huan didn't know whether she should cry or laugh. She obviously felt the hand that Gu Shiran's held hers tightened and tightened. His anger had already reached to the extreme, but his voice was still faintly. Courtesy is used when treating with people. I don't have the habit of apologizing to a pig. The fat man's face became red from anger. Take them down. Take him down for me. Someone at his side ignited the fire by saying vulgarly, "Young master, the little study companion behind him is also handsome." Halfway through the words, he felt a sharp gaze linger on his face. He didn't know why he suddenly feel a bit cold and he stopped speaking. He looked again at Gu Shiran. He saw that he was only wearing a light blue bamboo robe. There was a purse and a pendant on his waist. He looked neat and elegant but didn't have the atmosphere of someone rich. Presumably, he was someone from a well-off scholar who didn't have much power. Hence, his courage grew again and continued, "Why doesn't young master take the both of them down? It would be a pair then when bringing them back." The moment the fat man heard that disgusting gaze swept over Xu Huan. He laughed once, "Take the both down." Xu Huan wanted to vomit. She regretted that she didn't make time to learn judo or karate or something like that before and that she couldn't beat that fat man into a pig's head. She saw that those men narrowed the encirclement and rushed over to them. Gu Shiran's finger just moved when Ranmo shouted, "Who dares to hurt my master?" This little guy took out a bright dagger from his trouser and held it in his hand. However, he was not tall and weak. Not only did the opponents not care but they also seemed to have seen the most ridiculous thing in the world. They laughed out loudly. However, they just laughed when a figure flashed in. Somehow, he took the dagger from Ranmo's hand. The next moment, that dagger was on the neck of that fat man. As a result of the momentum, blood rushed out along the edge of the blade. The laughter stopped suddenly. All the people present were a bit stunned. They only heard the young man that held the dagger said coldly, "Die or let them go." Gu Shiha was originally so angry that he almost exploded. He almost rushed out to fight with them. After seeing this young man, the violent anger in his heart discharged a bit. He said stunned, "You." Xu Huan also breathed a sigh of relief. The heart that was already in her throat finally calmed down. The young man who helped them out of trouble was the same one they hired to help them. Let go, the fat man seemed like someone who cherished his life. He trembled from fear. No one knew whether he wanted his followers to let go or that he wanted the young man to let go. Let them go. The young man didn't let go of the dagger. The county magistrate is my brother. In law, are you not afraid of being arrested by the authorities? The fat man still had faith and put out his identity. Quickly let me go. I will not pursue this matter. The young man hesitated a bit. He didn't know how good the skills of those men who followed the fat man were, but they were accustomed to act ostentatiously and cause a riot. Hence, their guts were big. When they saw that they began to bluff. "Are you deaf? Quickly let our young master go. The officers will be here in a moment. If you don't want to sit in prison, then let go of the dagger in your hand. You even dare to provoke the brother. In law of the county magistrate. Are you tired of living? That young man looked around and faced those clear eyes of Gu Shiran. He tightened his heart, lifted his leg and hit the fat man's knee. The fat man had no choice but to kneel. His voice was cold and persistent, "Let them go." Chapter 41. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 8 Naked Man. In the end, the fat man still compromised. Since his small life was pinned in another's hand, he had no way but to compromise. With a shaking voice, he let his subordinates retreat. He also ordered that they couldn't attack. Then, he begged, "Gentlemen, can you now let go?" That young man hadn't said anything yet when Gu Shiran said, "Rope." Gu Shiha was surprised and hadn't reacted yet when Ranmo already cleverly run to the shopkeeper and asked for a rope. That shopkeeper didn't dare to give it and only looked at that fat man. The fat man said with a crying voice, "Give it to him. Quickly give it to him." They wanted a rope and not a knife. As long as he could keep his life, nothing else mattered. Who would have thought that when Ranmo came back with a rope, Gu Shiran didn't take it and only said, "Take off." Take off what? All the people present were surprised. Gu Shiran showed a smile, take off your clothes. His smile was very faint and carried a trace of darkness. When he gazed over, people somehow felt cold to the bones. Undressing in a public place. The fat man and his followers were a bit dumbfounded. Xu Huan scowled for a moment. She once again confirmed that you can provoke anyone but never provoke a black belly. The eyes of that young man also flashed a bit. Only Gu Shiha felt that the world was not already in enough of chaos. After hearing this, he seemed to have found something fun. He went forward and kicked that person who just now wanted to give him a slap. He said excitedly, "Didn't you hear? Undress. Young master." Those followers almost cried. They could do anything, but only this undressing bit was too shameful. However, their pleading gaze had been ignored by the fat man. He only wanted to save his life. What did the self-respect of others have to do with him? He shouted, "Undress, undress, undress. Do everything that this gentleman asks. Quickly undress." Those followers were dawdlers who bullied the weak and were afraid of the strong. They didn't know what courage meant, and after being for a long time under the fat man's abuse of authority, how could they have a rebellious mind? Everyone began to take off their clothes with a sorrowful look. There were still some female guests in the restaurant. When they saw such a scene, they began to scream. Some ran out and some even fainted. Only Xu Huan had her face bright red. She hasn't decided yet whether she should run out or close her eyes when she was taken into Gu Shiran's embrace. Then, his slightly cold hand reached over and blocked her eyes. A master hugged a handsome study companion. This scene was enough to make people have many thoughts. However, now everyone's eyes were on the followers who were undressing. Who would still care about such a thing? Only that young man frowned slightly. The fat man was someone who likes men. His life was pinned in the hand of another. When he saw the two hugging each other, he saw that handsome face of Gu Shiran. When he faced those cold but clear eyes of Gu Shiran, he couldn't help but swallow. An intertwined feeling of love and hate spread in his heart. Gu Shiran originally didn't want to a big deal out of things. He only planned to let the followers of the fat man undress to give him a warning. Now, seeing that very vulgar way the fat man looked at him with, his stomach turned. He opened his mouth slightly and said faintly, "You also undress. Take off every single piece." In less than a moment, 8 men faced each other. Their hands covered the most important part. They truly wished that they were dead. God knew that with such figures, even if they didn't cover, no one would want to look. The reason that the eyes of everyone in the restaurant were still locked on them was because this scene was too shocking. At this moment, Gu Shiran's interest also began to wane. He didn't look at them and only said, "Bind them together and throw them out." Pleading cries emerged. However, it was too late. Gu Shiran didn't get angry easily. When he really got angry, presumably his tactic of teaching someone a lesson would let that person unable to forget it for life. Those 8 men were eventually forced to tie the rope to each other, and they were tied facing each other. The last pair was the fat man and the guy who gave him a bad idea to also capture Xu Huan, which completely ignited Gu Shiran's anger. Gu Shiha and Ranmo personally tied them together. That rope was very tight. They made countless of knots. The fat man and that person's body were pasted against each other. Their faces were almost attached to each other. Even they felt that it was a bit disgusting. Inside the restaurant, it was very noisy. Outside, the restaurant was also surrounded by people who came to watch. As a result, when the fat man and his followers were thrown out, the people scattered. Then, they quickly flocked again. The whole street was full of screams from women and also the ridiculing laughter from men. When had the fat man suffered this kind of misery before? He screamed like a pig who was about to be killed, "Quickly! Untie the rope for this master. This master will reward heavily." The followers also clamored, our young master is the brother. In law of the county magistrate. They were naked and tied up like a zongzi. Originally no one recognized them. Now, they self-reported it. The onlookers got to know their identities. However, the fat man's behavior had been too rampant and he was too lecherous. Not only did he like men, he would also take liberties with pretty women. He could be described as the tyrant of Jingtian City. When mentioning him, the citizens of the city had many complaints. It was just, they couldn't afford to offend him. Normally, they would avoid him at all cost. How would they dare to provoke him? Now, seeing that he was in such a sorry state, everyone clapped and shouted that it was well done. Those who were bold enough picked up eggs and stones to throw at them, making them scream and cried even louder. Zongzi is a traditional Chinese rice dish made of glutinous rice stuffed with different fillings and wrapped in bamboo leaves. Among the chaos, Gu Shiran's group quietly walked out of the restaurant. The shopkeeper finally was brave enough to stop them. He didn't want compensation for the damaged tables, chairs and plates. He was afraid that after Gu Shiran left, that fat man would vent his anger on him. So, he teared up and begged them, "Gentlemen, you can't leave, ah. If you leave, then my restaurant would be closed down by the county magistrate. He won't." As Gu Shiran said this, he loosened the pendant from his waist and gave it to the shopkeeper. He appeased him, so many people were looking. Everyone could testify for you. The ones who offended the county magistrate are us. It has nothing to do with you. If he wants to vent his anger on you, then let them look at this pendant. Say you took it from the man and let them look for clues with it. His voice just fell when that silent young man became a little impatient. He suddenly threw out a punch that was fast like a thunderbolt. It fiercely fell on the shopkeeper's face. That shopkeeper screamed once from pain and then fell. He thought that he had angered these people. He was about to cry for mercy when he heard that young man say, "I apologize for the offense." In the end, he was someone who had mingled in the market for many years. When he heard this sentence, what more could he not understand? That shopkeeper held back his pain and pleaded gratefully, "This gentleman, can you please reward me with one more punch?" While talking, he also gestured for the servant to come over and begged that young man to also beat him. Xu Huan wanted to laugh. Gu Shihe didn't understand it. Ever since young, he had never seen someone beg to be beaten. He looked with shocking eyes at how the young man fulfilled the wish of the shopkeeper by giving them a few punches. Then, he was dragged out of the entrance by Gu Shiran while he was still in extreme shock. When he was at the entrance, he heard that shopkeeper shout like crazy, "Smash! Smash all the tables, chairs and plates for me." Hence, he thought that the shopkeeper got anxious in this mess and went mad. While he was in a daze, he felt Gu Shiran push him and said, "Do you still have money on you?" "I have." "Give me an ingot." Gu Shihe obediently took out a silver ingot. Gu Shiran let Ranmo give that ingot to the shopkeeper saying that it was compensation. After that, they left. No matter who caused this matter, it would not be right to implicate others. He hoped that the fat man would not vent his anger on the shopkeeper after seeing that the shopkeeper was also out of luck. Chapter 42. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Can't provoke a black belly. When Gu Shiran's group left the restaurant, it was very chaotic outside. No one paid attention to them. However, just going back like this didn't seem appropriate. While Gu Shiran was still thinking that, the young man suddenly asked, "Should I go hire a carriage?" He looked once at that young man and nodded. He also asked Ranmo to go to an unobtrusive ready-to-wear shop to buy some clothes. When everything was ready, they went to a quiet place and went into the carriage that the young man had hired. Gu Shihe was puzzled. He wanted to ask, but didn't know how to ask. When the carriage departed from the city, he couldn't hold it in anymore. "Where are we going?" "Go out of the city to throw off the tail and then come back." Gu Shiha was shocked, is someone following us? I don't know. You said to throw off the tail. Gu Shiran gave him a look as if he was asking a useless question, prevention before it happens. Gu Shiha turned his head dejectedly and looked at the young man. He was still holding on to the things that they had bought. He silently sat at a side in front of the door. No matter whether he looked left or right, up or down, he still felt that this person was very ordinary except for the cleanliness of his body. There was nothing out of the ordinary about him. He couldn't help but mutter, your skills are unexpectedly pretty good. When we entered the restaurant, you suddenly disappeared. I thought you stole the things and escaped. Little fourth. Gu Shiran shouted to stop him. Don't be rude. While talking, he cupped his hands at the young man to give him courtesy, thanking Knight for lending a helping hand just now. Shiran is grateful for it. He reported his name. That meant he was very sincere and grateful, but his voice was very low. He was afraid to be heard by the driver who was driving the carriage outside. The expression of that young man didn't change. He lowered his eyes and said, I'm not a knight. I was weak when I was young. To build up my health, I practiced punching and kicking for 2 years. I lend a helping hand because I was afraid that you will get into trouble and that I can't get my money. You don't have to thank me. Who would have thought that he saved people for this reason? Gu Shiha's eyes widened and he said resentfully, I thought that you saw injustice. After half a day, it was because of money. There was a bit of disdain in his voice. So deserving of a good spanking. This time, it was Shu Huan who knocked on his head, what's wrong with exchanging labor for money? Gu Shiha gasped. What the? He had no way when second big brother knocked him. Now, even his second sister Law who came from a poor family dares to knock him. Naturally, he wouldn't put importance on Shu Huan. He said angrily, I know your family is poor. Naturally you like money just like him. How would you understand what chivalry is? Gu Shiran's expression turned dark, but his tone was still faint, you understand. How can I not understand? Although, Gu Shiha didn't like to study, he had read a lot of those legendary novels about swordsmen and knights. Now, he carted up his sleeve and said, to help those in distress is the public spirit. Pooh, Shu Huan didn't hold back and laughed out loud. Gu Shiran also didn't know whether he should laugh or cry. Ranmo didn't dare to laugh, but it was very uncomfortable holding it back. His expression was strange. Only that young man's expression remained the same. He didn't even lift his eyelashes, but the slightly raised lips still revealed some deride. What are you doing? What are you all doing? Gu Shiha got irritated. The veins on his neck almost exploded, could it be that I said it wrong? Rare. Gu Shiran reached out and touched his head. He said with deep sorrow, it's rare that you still remembered some words even though you don't like to study. Was this a praise or a denunciation? How come he didn't feel right listening to it? Gu Shiha glared at him suspiciously. There was nothing wrong with what you'd said. However, at home, you will throw a temper when you don't get what you want. When the servants say a word wrong, you would beat them and also insult the teacher. Are these chivalrous? Gu Shiran smiled slightly, let's not talk about those that are far away. You look down on those who came from poor families. When others are in trouble, do you still expect yourself to reach out a helping hand? Gu Shiha's face turned red by his questions, but he still was unwilling to admit to it and muttered, what do these small matters have to do with chivalry? They indeed have nothing to do with chivalry. That is just to use one's status to bully people. Gu Shiran said faintly, if in the future, you don't control your tyrannical temper, you may grow up to have the same personality as that fat man that we just met. Gu Shiha got angry, you compare me with him. Am I such a jerk and so shameless? Although his heart was still pure and wasn't as shameless as the fat man, if he became hateful, it would really make people feel that he was unbearable. Shu Huan turned her face to not look at him and also didn't answer him. Gu Shiran was just smiling as if nothing was the matter. This made Gu Shiha angrier than just telling him the answer directly. He got angry, reached out, grabbed Ranmo's clothes and said, "You say it." "This little one," Ranmo said awkwardly. "It's not good if this little one says it." Gu Shiha gritted his teeth, "Even if it's not good you have to say it." Ranmo had an expression like he was at a funeral. "Fourth young master. You are extremely honorable and righteous. You help the needy for justice. Can you first let go of this little one?" Shu Huan got pain in her stomach from laughing. With the bumps of the carriage, she almost rolled down to the bottom of her seat if it wasn't because Gu Shiran had reached out to hold her. Only now did Gu Shiha discover that forcing people so aggressively didn't seem like a good behavior. He humped very dejectedly and glared once at Shu Huan. He let go and shrunk to a side and sulked. Angry. So angry. They actually put him on the same level as scums like the fat man. Gu Shiran looked at him with a smile and let him think about it himself. He also ignored him, GXH. Then, his gaze fell pensively on the young man. In fact, after hiring this person, when they turned into a corner, he inadvertently looked back. He saw that group of idlers gathered in one place and whispered. Some people looked up from time to time in the direction they departed. Hence, he felt that there was someone going against them. He wasn't sure. Until when the young man appeared again after having disappeared did he guess what had happened. Presumably, those idlers were unreconciled that their territory and business had been infringed by the young man. They wanted to teach him a lesson in private. For one, they could beat him and to let him know the rules. Secondly, they also could steal the things and plant the name of a thief who stole the properties of the master on him. A trap of killing two birds with one stone. Presumably, they didn't expect that the skills of this young man were quite good. One could imagine how they ended up. While he was in deep thoughts, he suddenly felt his sleeve being pulled lightly twice. He lowered his eyes and saw that Shu Huan was pulling his sleeves. He couldn't help but ask warmly, "What's the matter?" What was the thing in the bottle you poured in the restaurant?" It seemed to be very useful. She had long wanted to ask so that she could put 2 bottles on her in case something happens. Gu Shiran looked at her and laughed, "Hot pepper water." As he said that, his hand turned over and revealed a paper bag in his hand. "It's a pity that this stuff wasn't used." Shu Huan was a bit surprised. "What is this?" Gu Shiran didn't answer. "Take a look at it yourself." She took the paper bag over and carefully opened it. She discovered that some gray powder was wrapped inside. She hesitated. "This is..." Ranmo leaned over, looked once and said, "Limestone." Right. It was definitely quicklime. Hot pepper water, quicklime. He took these things with him when he went out. Shu Huan raised her head speechlessly. She didn't know whether she should praise or scorn Gu Shiran. Black belly, especially an unscrupulous black belly like him, really couldn't be provoked. Chapter 43. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The pendant Shu Huan moved intuitively to a side, trying to stay away from Gu Shiran, but who would have known that in the next moment, the carriage suddenly shook and she landed naturally back into his arms. The carriage was very narrow. It was very packed with 5 people in it. Even if she wanted to stay far away from him, she had nowhere to escape to. She had no choice but to sit down peacefully, but when she raised her head, she saw that the young man's lips were curved in an unnatural angle as he looked at them. Only now did she remember that she was dressed as a study companion now. That she was so close to Gu Shiran, in other people's eyes, it was nothing more than thinking that she was a kept man. Her face suddenly burned red. To cover up, she just talked about something. "Why did you give the shopkeeper your pendant? What if they found out?" Gu Shiran smiled faintly. "I am afraid that they wouldn't go investigate. There is no mark on the pendant and the carving is also not good. If they investigate following that path, they would obtain nothing." While talking, he turned his head and reminded Gu Shiha and Ranmo, if you don't want to be punished, don't say a word when we are back home. Ranmo nodded. Gu Shiha muttered dissatisfied, I'm not that stupid. This person's zodiac animal really should be a fox. Xu Huan reached into the bag in her sleeve to touch that waist pendant carved from the wonderful redwood of Inga. She felt that now was a good moment to give him the gift. It was just that there were too many people on this carriage. There was also an outsider here. While thinking, she retrieved her hand. She didn't expect that Gu Shiran's eyes were so sharp. He already discovered her small movement. He reached out to touch her sleeve. What are you hiding? Nothing. Xu Huan quickly dodged her hand. The carriage once again jolted. Their faces almost glued to one another. Gu Shiha was dumbfounded and scolded them, hey you two. Don't go overboard. Don't look at things that aren't consistent with propriety. Why are your eyes so big? Gu Shiran didn't mind and retorted him. However, his hand already got into Xu Huan's sleeve. He pulled out a silk string. A waist pendant fell into his palm. This is. A familiar scent came to the surface, but he obviously didn't pay attention to it. He was at loss staring at that chubby rogue rabbit. Gu Shiha also leaned over, what kind of thing is this? Is it a cat or a dog? Why is it fat like this? Xu Huan wanted to cry, this is a rabbit. After Gu Shiha heard that, he showed a regretful look, great. You used a piece of top-quality wonderful redwood of Inga to carve a rabbit. Xu Huan was dejected, is it really so ugly? Gu Shiha didn't even raise his head and said with confidence, so ugly. Have you seen someone use such a waist pendant? If you wanted to carve, you should have carved a dragon, a phoenix, a unicorn or something like that. Xu Huan suffered a big blow. She reached out and grabbed that silk string with the rogue rabbit pendant. Return it back to me. Originally, I wanted to give this to you as your birthday gift, but it's too ugly. I will give you something else another day. Who would have thought that Gu Shiran tightened his fist and held that waist pendant tightly in his hand? He smiled slightly and asked, you carved it yourself. Xu Huan nodded and didn't hide Gu Shiha's merits. She said honestly, Little Fourth helped me find the redwood. Very good. Gu Shiran tied the waist pendant on his waist. I like it. The chubby rogue rabbit bumped along the carriage on his waist. That rabbit with squinted eyes looked very much like a jerk who deserved a good spanking. Xu Huan regretted it deeply. If she had known, she wouldn't have carved this. Regardless of his personality, from his outer appearance, Gu Shiran was such a handsome man. With this rogue rabbit on his waist, it felt a bit out of place. While she was thinking about how she could get that waist pendant back, suddenly her hand was grasped by Gu Shiran. She struggled for a short while but couldn't take her hand away. When she raised her head to look at him, his face was calm as if nothing was the matter. She sighed and no longer struggled. Anyway, no matter how she perceived the relationship between them, they were husband and wife in the eyes of others. Moreover, before she left Gu household, the intimacy he inadvertently showed to her was her best protection. When the carriage went a bit further, they arrived at the closest village near Jingtian City. When they went out of the carriage, they paid the driver and let him drive one more round with an empty carriage. After confirming that no one followed them, they advanced to the village. They found a house to change into other clothes that Ranmo had bought and also bought some food. This time, Xu Huan changed back into women's clothes. However, it was the clothes of a maid. She asked a young wife to help her do the simple hairstyle of 2 buns. She didn't expect that when the young man returned from hiring a carriage inside the village, he looked strangely at her. Naturally, this kind of strangeness wasn't admiration but a mixture of disgust and dislike. It could be seen that he already restrained himself very much to not let such a disgust show on his face, but he still inevitably showed some abnormality. Gu Shiran saw this situation. He called the young man to a quiet place and asked him, I was also physically weak and was ill since a young age. I've always wanted to hire a martial artist to learn some kung fu to strengthen my body. I wonder if Knight is willing to teach me. The young man didn't answer. Suddenly he asked an irrelevant question, is your study companion a boy or a girl? Gu Shiran didn't hide it from him and said, a girl. The expression of the young man didn't change, but he seemed relieved. He asked, what is the wage? Can you pay me first? The moment he opened his mouth, he asked about the wage. Others would consider this very rude, but Gu Shiran liked his straightforwardness because it's always worry-free to communicate with those who say things directly. Gu Shiran smiled slightly, Knight is very short of money. The young man hesitated a little and then nodded. I came here with my mother to find a relative. However, the relative had long moved away. I couldn't find his whereabouts. The travel money had been exhausted. Now, mother is seriously ill and is staying for a long period in the inn. We have no money to see a doctor. Before, when they heard him spoke, he didn't speak as roughly as an average idler. He was wondering why with such good skills he fell to the point of being an idler who helped others carry things. After hearing his explanation, he got to know the reason. Gu Shiran got curious about his identity and background. They just met for the first time and weren't close with each other. It wasn't right for him to ask too much. He smiled, this is easy. I know a famous doctor in Jingtian City. When we go back to the city, I will ask him to go see Aunt, alright. Knight doesn't have to worry about the medical expenses. Who would have thought that the young man would shake his head? The medical expenses should be deducted from my wage. Gu Shiran laughed, then, Knight accepted. That young man nodded, hesitated a bit and said, you don't have to call me Knight. My name is Du Chio. Gu Shiran bowed with his hand held in front, what about I call you Master Du? Du Chio seemed to only have concerns when talking about his identity. He didn't care much about other things. He said, do what you like. You can also call me by my name, but you don't have to be so polite. You spend money, I take the money. You can order me to do anything. The two talked at this side, at that other side. Gu Shiha had long become impatient. He made Ranmo come over to call them to get in the carriage. This time, it wasn't because Gu Shiha was impatient. It was that they still needed an hour to get back into the city. It was beginning to get dark now. If they don't go back soon, he didn't know what would happen if old madam couldn't find him. If he implicated Xu Huan and leaked that she went outside the residence with them, then things would get troublesome. Chapter 44 You are listening at novelfull.audio. The house of Danqing because the food they bought from the village wasn't as fine and tasty, Gu Shiha had been complaining the whole way back. However, his stomach was too famished and also complaining. He had no way but to eat some of it. When he heard that Gu Shiran hired Du Chio as his martial master, Gu Shiha's eyes widened and he stopped complaining. Is this true? Gu Shiran glanced once at him, do I have to lie to you? Hearing him say that, Gu Shiha immediately looked pickily at Du Chio. However, no matter how he looked, aside from discovering that Du Chio's body was well proportioned and that his limbs were tough and strong, he didn't see much more. He couldn't believe that a person who looked so ordinary could have good skills. Fortunately, he saw the scene of Du Chio saving them in the restaurant with his own eyes. Although he had doubts, he couldn't deny that he had skills. After being at loggerheads for a while, when he thought that he could also follow to learn some kung fu, he truly felt happy and said, great. The mind of a child was as simple as that. He intuitively liked or disliked someone. He intuitively judged whether something was good or bad. Gu Shiran didn't say more. He only reminded Gu Shiha to pick a day to report to old madam saying that he, GXH, wanted to hire a martial master to teach him some kung fu to strengthen the body. Presumably, old madam wouldn't dismiss his request. Little fourth young master also didn't ask much and promised to do it. It was Du Qiu who insisted on not living inside Gu residence. He wanted to stay outside as it would be easier to care for his mother. He only promised to come every day at the appointed time to teach them martial arts. Gu Shiran needed a martial artist and not a servant. He didn't have the intention to bind Du Qiu to his side. So, he amiably agreed with Du Qiu. The carriage rushed back to the city. The order of the street had been restored. Gu Shihe couldn't help but get excited. He raised the curtain and sneaked a peek outside. He wanted to hear whether the pedestrians would gossip about what had happened before. The result was that he was pulled back by Shu Huan and the curtain had been covered. Sit well. Don't let people recognize you. What are you afraid of? Gu Shihe objected. Second big brother never leaves the residence. Even many people in the residence don't recognize him. Old madam also rarely let me go out. How could someone recognize us? Shu Huan still felt that it was better to be safe. Perhaps someone remembered our faces just now. It's always not good to be seen. It's better to be careful. Gu Shihe was a bit dissatisfied, but after all, they caused trouble. Even if he was fearless, he still felt guilty. When he saw that the gay's second big brother looked at him with was full of disapproval, he humped once and sat back down obediently. The carriage went into the direction that Ranmo had pointed at and finally stopped at the place where Dr. Ji lived. That was a two-story house. The house was planted with young and lovely herbs. There were also green bamboos. When they were led inside by an old servant, Shu Huan felt that this place wasn't contaminated with the trace of the summer heat at all. Everywhere was quiet and full of greens. The irritation in her heart disappeared. A famous doctor didn't have to sit in a clinic to receive people. There would naturally be people who would come at his door to seek medical treatment. It was just that the consultation fee was relatively high. So, when the citizens got a small illness, they would just go to the pharmacy to buy medication and the poor would definitely not visit here. They didn't know whether it was because they were lucky today, but Dr. Ji didn't go make a house call. He was drawing in the study. When they entered, they saw that he was sitting there, concentrating hard on the painting. He ignored when outsiders came to visit. All his attention was on the painting in front of him. This kind of behavior was naturally a bit lacking. Fortunately, the old servant took over the hospitality and invited them to sit. Then, he went to make tea. Shu Huan had studied painting. Although in the past, she rarely came in contact with ink and wash painting, her interest was still there. She couldn't help but take a look. She found out that Dr. Ji was painting the bamboo outside of the window. When she turned and looked at the study, it was quite big. However, the furnishing was extremely simple. Aside from the big and fancy table in front of the window, there were only a few chairs. The bookshelf was full of books and there were paintings hanging on the wall. Without exception, bamboo was painted on all those paintings. Static bamboo, bamboo in the breeze, bamboo under the wind, bamboo in the rain. No matter what kind of bamboo was painted, it was the bamboo in its natural state. Even if the mood was different, but the technique was obviously similar to the one that Dr. Ji was painting. When she looked at the signature of the painting, there was Danqing written on it. It should be Dr. Ji's name, right? After living here for so many days, she figured out that here was slightly different from the ancient world she learned from the history books. At least, the people here didn't have many taboos about naming someone and it was also not popular to use a courtesy name. Just as Shu Huan was appreciating the paintings on the wall, Ji Danqing had already finished the final stroke. He put the brush stained with ink into a green powdered paper to clean the brush. He stood up and smiled at Gu Shiran. I didn't know that honorable guests will pay me a visit today. Excuse me for my lack of manners. During the speech, he saw Shu Huan who was dressed like a maid and still looking at the painting. To avoid arousing suspicion, he only nodded at her as a greeting. Gu Shiran returned the etiquette and said, "It was us who came abruptly." After the exchange of conventional greeting, he said the reason why he came today. Ji Danqing had a humane heart of a doctor. Naturally, he promised and immediately called a servant boy to let him prepare the things for a house call. Du Qiu always thought that famous doctors had more arrogance. He thought that since it wasn't early anymore, the doctor may not be willing to do a house call. He didn't expect that Ji Danqing agreed. He couldn't help but feel relieved. Some gratitude also showed in the eyes that always hid his emotions. However, Gu Shiran suddenly stopped Dr. Ji. "Take it slowly. I still want to inquire about something from Dr. Ji." Ji Danqing smiled gently and said, "Please say it. Is there a small house for rent nearby here?" Ji Danqing's eyes showed his puzzlement. Gu Shiran explained the matter of Du Qiu being his martial master. He wanted to find a place not far away from Gu residence and where the surroundings were quiet. It would be a good place for Mother Du to recuperate and also avoid it that Du Qiu had to run to two places every day. It would also save Dr. Ji a lot of time and effort when Dr. Ji goes on a house call if the place was close by. Ji Danqing probably also belonged to the kind of person who didn't ask about mundane affairs. Naturally, there was no result in asking him about this matter. He called the old servant to ask, but the answer was disappointing. Here was the quietness among the noisiness. It wasn't far from the main streets, but the sounds of the city wouldn't get here. Therefore, many of the houses in the vicinity were bought by rich people or officials. If they didn't use the place because of its quietness, they would use it to keep a mistress. There was no house to be sold or rented. In the end, after Ji Danqing was silent for a while, he suddenly said, "If Master Du doesn't mind, there are 2 secluded rooms in my backyard. Please come and live here." Gu Shiran didn't expect that he would let strangers live in his house. When he heard that, he was surprised. Even Du Qiu had doubts whether he had misunderstood. He declined, "This is too much of a bother for you." "There's no harm," Dr. Ji said. "Those rooms in the backyard were originally reserved for critically ill patients, so I can keep watch and take care of their medication all the time. Moreover, I haven't taken a wife yet. So, there are no females that need to be avoided. It wouldn't be a bother." Du Qiu hesitated, "Is Dr. Ji not afraid that I am someone bad?" After Ji Danqing heard that, he laughed, "I was born into a family of doctors. Aside from the medical books and herbs in this house, I don't have other things that are of value. How could I be afraid that someone would harm me to make a fortune? You don't have to worry about this. Sometimes, patients in need of emergency would come. I will also let them stay here." Nothing had happened all these years. Du Qiu asked again, "Then the rent?" Ji Danqing raised his hand to interrupt him, "We can talk about that later. It's more important to look at the sick." While he talked, he carried his medical coffer and let Du Qiu lead the way. When they boarded the carriage they went to the city with, Gu Shiran paid his goodbyes and let Ranmo go hire sedan chairs to go back home. Chapter 45. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The interrogation. After going out, they went through a lot of trouble. From a horse carriage, they changed into a mule carriage before changing into sedan chairs. On the way, they changed clothes. Gu Shiran also cautiously let the person who lifted the sedan chair go around a big circle. Not to mention that they didn't discover anyone following them. Even if someone followed them, he would have become dizzy by his tactics. When they went down from the sedan chair and entered the residence, Xu Huan kept her head down and hid behind Ranmo. Although the 2 doorkeepers wondered why when 4th young master went out, he was followed by 2 study companions, and when he came back, he returned with a study companion and a maid, but they haven't seen Xu Huan before and also couldn't see her lowered face. They naturally didn't recognize her and they also didn't want to anger this violent 4th young master. So, they did as if they didn't see anything. When they walked around the residence, with Gu Shihe opening the road at the front and sent the maids away when he encountered them. Shu Huan returned to Plum Flower Pavilion without thrills. When they crossed the threshold, they discovered that there was no one in the yard. It was so quiet that it was disturbing and people couldn't help but feel ill at ease. Shu Huan couldn't help but cast a nervous look at Gu Shiran and guessed whether something could have happened. When they walked into the main hall and raised the curtain, they saw concubine Yun sitting there with a cold face. In front of her, maid Hui Yun was kneeling. Only when she saw them, did she come to greet them, and she seemed more relieved. "Second young master, you finally returned." Gu Shiran's face sank. "Is it her?" That when Shu Huan saw Hui Yun, her heart also sank. She also understood the reminders Gu Shiran gave concubine Yun before leaving. When she thought about those words, she naturally could guess the meaning behind them. Concubine Yun answered in a low voice, "I also don't know. I waited for second master to interrogate her personally when you come back." The atmosphere inside the room suddenly fell silent. They could only see that the back that Hui Yun faced them with was shaking slightly. Gu Shihe, who followed them inside, was puzzled. "What are you talking about? Why don't I understand?" Fourth young master, only now was concubine Yun able to greet him. She urged, "Quickly go see old madam. She sent Zisu to look everywhere for you. They also come here to ask many times. I only answered that you didn't come over." After Gu Shihe heard this, he got a bit anxious. He couldn't care about what had happened in this room. After all, it had nothing to do with him. He went out with his study companions Ranmo and Dian. Gi Shiran said, "Remember to put a lock on your mouth." "I know. Second big brother, you are so long-winded." While Gu Shihe answered, he ran away. Shu Huan sighed. She returned first to the inner room to change her clothes to avoid looking inappropriate when people come in and see her like this. However, while she was changing, she still kept an ear on what was happening outside. She heard concubine Yun close the door and reported in a low voice about what had happened after they left the residence. It was as Gu Shiran had expected. No one came to visit Plum Flower Pavilion after the master and eldest young master of this residence returned. The maids were still obedient. No one went out. Only Zisu came 3 times. The first time was to bring the banquet that old madam let people prepare. The last 2 times were to ask about the whereabouts of Gu Shihe. Concubine Yun answered her half-heartedly. She didn't expect that at the last time, when she finished talking with Zisu and was about to go back to her room, she inadvertently saw Hui Yun move quietly to Zisu's side as if she had something to say. She shouted to stop Hui Yun on spot. She asked Hui Yun to go pour tea. Then, she used the excuse that the tea was too hot, smashed the teacup and punished Hui Yun to kneel here. The other maids had also been sent to their own room and were not allowed to come out. After Shu Huan changed, raised the curtain and came out, she saw that Gu Shiran was sitting in the main seat with a calm face. Then, she heard concubine Yun sigh again, "I only suspected Xiao Yun and never thought that it would be her, She had always been obedient and honest. I also couldn't bear to ask." In fact, Shu Huan also had the same doubts. Although, she had also suspected Hui Yun, but she didn't understand why Hui Yun would do this. She was only a maid and she was Gu Shiran's maid. Why did she had to participate in these fights and schemes? Gu Shiran saw that she came out. He gestured at her and said, "You come and interrogate me." Gu Shiran didn't explain much and said, "Your internal affairs." This was forcing her into the role of the main wife. Shu Huan laughed bitterly for a moment. She walked to Gu Shiran and sat down next to him. When she looked, she saw the smashed teacup in front of Hui Yun and her slightly shaking body. She looked truly innocent and pitiful. However, if she was really innocent, she wouldn't have knelt her and waited to be interrogated. After looking at her for a long while, she asked in a deep voice, "Are you really the one who disclosed information at old madam's?" Hui Yun had always been calm, but now had a guilty conscience and had knelt for half a day. She was very afraid now. After she heard concubine Yun report the matter, she knew that she had no way to argue. She remained silent because she was afraid that she couldn't speak. She forced herself to kneel till she couldn't move, like a stone. When she heard Shu Huan's question now, although it was in a low voice, the string that tightened in her heart broke. She couldn't hold it in anymore and fell to the ground. She wept while she kowtowed, "This slave know that this slave is wrong. This slave asks second young mistress to please spare this slave this time." Shu Huan raised an eyebrow and asked, "Why?" Hui Yun didn't answer and just pled for mercy. "I will ask you one more time." "Why?" Hui Yun hesitated, "Second young mistress." Shu Huan waited for a moment. After seeing that she didn't say more after that, she also got angry. She stood up and said, "I finished asking. To beat or to sell, you see it yourself." After living together for these few days, how could Hui Yun not know that she, didn't like to meddle and that she had an indifferent personality? If she begged her, she may still have an opportunity to live. If even she, got angry, second young master had always pampered her, so he will naturally not tolerate her, Concubine Yun looked like she had a good temperament, but if one had offended her, she wouldn't be forgiving. Thinking till here, Hui Yun grasped Shu Huan's clothes like grabbing on her last hope and wept, "Second young mistress, don't leave. This slave will tell you everything." It was very hard for her to spit out this sentence. However, she really didn't want to say it. Hence, she couldn't help but pause again. Until when Shu Huan couldn't take it anymore and wanted to pry her hands open, did she harden her heart and wept, "This slave was originally old madam's slave. After concubine entered was this slave sent over to serve second young master. It was just that old madam wasn't assured of concubine's background." She didn't finish yet when concubine Yun suddenly stood up and said, "I will go pour tea." There was awkwardness and impatience in those words. However, Gu Shiran had his eyes lowered and seemed to have no sense of consciousness. Shu Huan swept once surprised over concubine Yun. After she left did she, retrieve her gaze. She saw that Hui Yun only cared about wiping her tears with an expression of not knowing whether she should continue or not. She said, "Continue." Hui Yun continued, "Old madam was afraid that second young master would suffer grievances. Hence, she let this slave come to look after second young master. If there was something, I had to report to old madam immediately." Talking till here, she kowtowed and wept again, "Second young mistress, this slave doesn't dare to defy old madam. I truly had no other way. It was really not my own intention, please, forgive this slave this time." She cried miserably. The ground was also full of broken porcelain. After she kowtowed several times, there was blood on her forehead. Shu Huan frowned and said, "No need to kowtow more. Stand up and talk." Hui Yun suddenly raised her eyes full of hope, "Second young mistress, are you willing to forgive this slave?" Shu Huan looked at her for a while. Her brows gradually unfrowned. She said faintly, "I will decide after you finished." "This slave," Hui Yun bit her lips. "Have finished." "Really?" Shu Huan smiled slightly. "You haven't told me what old madam promised you." One sentence poked into Hui Yun's soft spot. It successfully turned her face into the paleness of defeat. Her bright eyes also dimmed. Chapter 46. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The hidden mind. The miserable appearance of Hui Yun was indeed pitiful and would make people feel compassion. If someone who didn't know the ins and outs of the matter entered now, they would really think that Shu Huan had a poisonous heart and was maltreating a maid. Who would know that it was because Hui Yun had betrayed her masters and reported to the other side that almost caused the destruction of Shu Huan's reputation, she would be divorced and driven out of Gu residence. The person didn't have the heart to harm the tiger, but the tiger had the wish to injure the person. To this point, Huiyun was still shirking the responsibility and telling half-truths and half-lies. Aside from being afraid to be punished, there was no feeling of remorse. After having hardened her heart, Xu Huan sat down firmly. Her calm eyes stared at Huiyun, waiting for her to continue. In fact, even if she didn't say it, she could guess what benefits old madam had promised her. To the ancient women who were restricted by virtues and who couldn't have a career and be independent, what could be more tempting than a good man who they could rely on? Sure enough, Huiyun couldn't stand against the interrogation and told everything while she wept. The benefit that old madam promised her was that after Gu Shiran had married and got a bit better, she, would return her, slave contract, prepare a dowry for her and grandiosely make her into a concubine. A concubine wasn't a maid to warm the bed. A concubine had face and respect. What's more, she was to be taken in after her slave contract had been returned. Even if she wasn't an honorable concubine, she would be of higher status than concubine Yun. If she also gave birth to a son, then she wouldn't have to worry about the future anymore. It was always better than being given to a servant when she reached adulthood. If that was the case, then the child she'd give birth to would also still be a slave and endure a hard and poor life. Of course, Huiyun only said what she could say openly. The words that she couldn't say openly, she buried them deep in her heart. Originally, she didn't have any admiration for the frail and sick-second young master. Even if she became his concubine, she would have to worry when he would die and let her fall again from the high branch back to her original place. Because of her identity as a maid and because she was afraid that if she served poorly, she would be punished by old madam, so, she had always been carefully caring for him. Until when he married Xu Huan, she saw his body get better day after day. There were also more smiles on his face and he wasn't so uncommunicative and antisocial as before. Also, he showed confidence with every gesture and he got more handsome and refined every passing day. All of these made her captivated. She couldn't control her heart from being moved. She wanted to see him every day and at every moment. She wanted to stay at his side all her life. It was just, these changes didn't happen because of her but they happened because of the second young mistress in front of her. Every perspicacious person could see how much he indulged and cherished this second young mistress who came from a poor family, who didn't even have a dowry. She was only a youthful beauty who had a lucky life. They were all daughters from a poor family. Why could she only be a maid and in order to become a concubine, she had to rack her brain for schemes, while this second young mistress didn't have to do anything? She didn't even see her, be respectful and fawn upon second young master. Why was she able to be loved in the palm of his hands? Such a strong contrast made her unable to not feel resentful and jealous. She felt resentful that the heavens was unfair and jealous because she, could get second young master's love. Huiyun was used to hiding her thoughts and never revealed her emotions on her face. If it was like this, she would just bite her teeth and endure it. After all, she had never expected to be the only one to be pampered and loved. Moreover, now she was just a maid. She only wished to keep watch every few days at the small kitchen outside of the curtain to be close to second young master. While he was asleep, she could use to opportunity when she was tucking him in to look at him quietly. She didn't expect that the heavens wasn't even willing to grant such a humble request from her. After this second young mistress began to sleep in the main chamber, second young master no longer let people stay up at night. Sometimes, he would even act cute to let second young mistress do things like washing his face. Not to mention the medication. He would only drink the medicine brought by second young mistress instead of smashing the bowl in anger. Second young mistress also picked two well-behaved and good-looking personal maids. She didn't know whether she, wanted to let them become second young masters after she, had lost favor. So, she could get favored again and show her virtuousness. Anyway, even such a gentle and cautious woman like concubine Yun, who was the only one to be favored by second young master, had fallen from grace. Such a maid like her naturally had less chance to get close to second young master. Their love and affection were a piercing pain in her heart. So painful that she had to use all her efforts to not show anything on her face. That was the moment when she discovered that she had deviated from her original intention to come to Plum Flower Pavilion. Originally, she only wished to have a peaceful and stable life. Now, she was caught in the sad situation where love gave birth to hate and she had no way back. When the small room in Plum Flower Pavilion caught fire, it was she who took advantage that there was no one outside in the quiet night and that everyone was in the land of dreams, to sneak out and report to old Madam's personal maid. However, she didn't expect that concubine Yun would also stick a foot in this matter by using the outspoken Xiao Yun. This inadvertently covered for her. It was her who spread the rumor that second young mistress was pregnant. When she went to send the piece of cloth to Shu family, she inquired a bit about that young scholar who taught her, how to read. She also heard a bit outside of concubine Yun's chamber. Then, she reported it to old Madam. It was a pity that there was only a sachet. There wasn't much to show the affair. Second young mistress cut her wrist in front of old Madam to show her chastity and easily touched old Madam's heart. Instead, it was concubine Yun who got reprimanded for being meddlesome. The repeated failures made her resentment deeper. When she found out it was fake that second young mistress cut her wrist and had been taken out for a stroll by second young master, she couldn't stand it anymore. She knew that old Madam hated it the most when someone deceived her. If old Madam got to know about this matter, she could borrow old Madam's hand to completely push second young mistress outside of Gu household and let her disappear forever from second young master's life. She had always been cautious. The first 2 times that Zissou came over, when she found out that she didn't have a way to pass the information, she could still keep her composure. When Zissou came for the last time, she felt that she would waste the opportunity if she missed this time. She had to take the risk and thought that even if she was discovered by concubine Yun would remain silent because they had a tacit mutual understanding. She calculated everything, but didn't count on that second young master would give concubine Yun a reminder before leaving. If something happened, concubine Yun would bear the full responsibility. Such a clever person naturally would refuse to take the blame for her. Moreover, concubine Yun was already angry at her because of the matter of the sachet. Things had evolved to such an irremediable state. Huiyun cried on the ground. She wasn't remorseful. She was afraid of how she would be disposed of. If she was beaten, she could grit her teeth and endure it. If she was sold, she would be consigned to eternal damnation. Xu Huan didn't know that she, had so many hidden thoughts that she didn't say out loud. Even if she, could guess it, she would have to waste a lot of energy to guess them step by step. She didn't have the hobby to waste her brain cells on such obscure things. She also didn't like to let other people's negativity affect her relatively clear and bright state of mind. Hence, she only looked at Huiyun for a short moment and asked Gu Shiran how to deal with her. Gu Shiran wasn't sure about Huiyun's out-of-the-ordinary feelings towards him. However, he could sense them a bit. He felt that it was really dangerous to let her stay by his side. He didn't want to see something happen to Xu Huan again. So, he just said, "Sell her." Those words coming from his mouth was a big blow to Huiyun. She knelt on the ground and didn't even have the strength to beg for mercy. She only felt very painful in her heart. When the corner of her eyes swept over the broken porcelain, she immediately reached out and wanted to pick it up. However, Xu Huan had been paying attention to her. When she saw Huiyun's hand move, she, immediately swept away the broken porcelains in front of Huiyun with her foot. Then, she said, "Go marry someone. You don't have to learn from me to cut your wrist." That was a desperate attempt of Huiyun which exerted all her strength. After being interrupted, she didn't have the mind to try again. After all, suicide also required a great deal of courage. She could only cry on the ground. She heard Xu Huan faintly say to concubine Yun who came in with tea, "Call someone to sweep the broken porcelain from the ground." I don't want to get the reputation of forcing a maid to death for someone. When the words fell, Hui Yun raised her eyes astonished. Through her tears, she saw the face of concubine Yun that had turned pale. Chapter 47. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The warning. It wasn't the first time that she encountered concubine Yun's scheme. However, this time Xu Huan felt particularly tired. She had thought before that after the matter of yesterday, she would be able to spend a few peaceful days. She didn't expect that a day hadn't even passed when she was schemed against again. I don't know if it is that you don't understand or that I haven't made myself clear enough. Xu Huan looked concubine Yun in the eyes. I don't like schemes. I just don't like it. I'm not so stupid as to be schemed against so many times and still have no idea what is going on. Concubine Yun's face paled and then turned red. She rushed to argue, second young mistress, I didn't, I was just careless and negligent and forgot to clean up. Xu Huan smiled faintly. If this was said by Qiao Yun, I may have still believed it. You are usually so cautious and careful, would you be negligent and careless? Seeing that concubine Yun still wanted to argue, she already raised her hand to stop her. Of course, without evidence, it was only smashing a teacup and forgot to clean up. If I truly punish you, in the eyes of others, it would be that I am deliberately making things difficult for you and that I am being unreasonable. Don't worry, I will do as if this matter had never happened. However, no matter whether you were truly careless or faked your carelessness, in the future, don't commit such error again. Concubine Yun bit her lips, lowered her eyes and said, thanking second young mistress for the grace of not punishing. Yen will certainly be more cautious next time. No need to thank me. You can also hate me, Xu Huan said coldly. But, I will warn you in advance. No matter how good my temper is, I also have a limit. If you want something, go ask the main character. Don't go into circles and design schemes for me. I only know that if people don't offend me, I won't offend them. If I'm bullied too hard, I won't fight back with schemes, but what I will do is not leave any face for you and make you unable to live peacefully in the future. After these words fell, not to mention concubine Yun, even Hui Yun widened her eyes and was very surprised. They had never met someone who acted out of the ordinary like Xu Huan. Gu household's Madame Lin sure could be considered someone difficult to deal with. However, no matter how much she hated those beautiful concubines and maids to warm the bed, in front of master and outsiders, she had to pretend to be virtuous. She would only act behind the scenes. Now, second young master was still sitting here. This second young mistress put the fights and schemes between the wife and the concubines in the open with no restraint. She even threatened them. Could it be that she wasn't afraid that second young master would find her too vicious? Of course, when they sneaked a peek at Gu Shiran, they found out that not only did this second young master not show any dislike for the main wife, instead, he propped his chin and his eyes shone with crystal-clear brightness and looked at the scene with keen pleasure. Concubine Yun still wanted to open her mouth to redeem the image she had in front of second young master. Who would have thought that Xu Huan did as if she didn't hear it, turned and walked to the inner room. She also dropped, no need to be surprised. I threatened you. I advise you to keep my words in mind. I wasn't joking with you. At the very least, she wasn't good-hearted enough to joke with her future and life. However, after she vented out the words she'd wanted to say for a long time, she felt more comfortable. As for the mess outside, there was Gu Shiran to deal with that. To put it bluntly, wasn't it all because of this fatale that she would repeatedly encounter such dejected things? While she was blaming the fatale walked in and closed the door. He laughed, second young mistress is ferocious. Sorry. Xu Huan smugly opened the rosewood-carved jewelry box on the dressing table. She stared at the small box of jewelry and said, I also don't want to embarrass that beloved concubine of yours, but my silent endurance and tolerance only made her actions worse. You know, I am a selfish and vicious person. I can't take other people's face as more important than my life. In the future, if she doesn't change, I wouldn't mind putting those threatening words into action. I know you won't go overboard. Do what you want to do. You don't have to worry about me. Gu Shiran spoke with a serious face, but while he talked, he reached out from behind her and closed the jewelry box. As long as you don't calculate on how to leave me every day. Shu Huan looked back in surprise. She didn't know whether he was just saying that or that he really read her mind. Seeing her surprised face, Gu Shiran smiled slightly. I'm being serious. I'm not joking with you. Please remember that you are my officially wedded wife. You are not alone. If there is anything you are unhappy about in the future, you can tell me. You don't have to bear it alone. Shu Huan was dumbfounded. She truly didn't expect that he would say such a thing because from her impression, she thought he would laugh teasingly and then tell her, if there is anything you are unhappy about in the future, please tell me to let me rejoice. Gu Shiran looked at her expression and probed, I think, should be deserving of your trust, right? He was not wrong. From the moment she woke up here until now, no matter what had happened, he had protected and trusted her unconditionally. Shu Huan had long felt tired. Her heart swayed for a moment. She truly wanted to give up on leaving Gu household, give up on leaving him and living alone because that would be very difficult. Besides, she wouldn't have such good luck again in the future to meet someone who would treat her better than him, who was more outstanding and who was worthy to let her rely on. It was also a troublesome matter that he was too outstanding. Thinking about concubine Yun, thinking about Hui Yun and thinking about that there may be many more women in the future who would be unscrupulous because they liked him, her little swaying sentiment in her heart had disappeared. Even in the modern society where monogamy was the public opinion and where there was moral constraint, there were still many mistresses with fatal attraction. Not to mention this ancient society without restriction to take in concubines. Shu Huan barely squeezed out a smile and said, I will remember your words. This was a sentence without much sincerity. It was like the poker monk Lu deeply saying to the elder that he would remember. Although she would remember, this didn't mean that she would really do it. It simply meant that she would seriously think about it. Gu Shiran looked at her silently for a while. He didn't say anything else. In the next few days, it was peaceful in Gu household. Master Gu and eldest young master returned home in advance because they encountered a little trouble in business. They closed the door and discussed for a whole day and night with old madam before it was solved. It wasn't important to the point to affect the mood of everyone in the family. Plum Flower Pavilion was also unusually quiet. The martial master that Gu Shiran had hired didn't come these days because he had to take care of his mother. In the meantime, Hui Yun hasn't been married off yet, but she was banned from going out. Even concubine Yun was a lot more well behaved. When she saw Shu Huan, she was even more submissive and docile than before. The things that Shu Huan had to do daily were recuperate, chat with Gu Shiran, find some suitable wood to practice her carving on and to use this to pass the long and slow day. If the days were so peaceful and there were no further troubles, if Gu Shiran had never taken a concubine, then someone like Shu Huan who strove for stability and calmness, who had no grand ideals or ambitions and who was lazy could perhaps slowly give up her obsession on leaving, adapt to the circumstance with a good will and no longer deliberately find a way out for herself. It was a pity that everything was just ifs. On this day, she inadvertently heard Liangchen and Meijing gossip and caused her gradually calm heart to go up half in the air again.